Professor Lackenbauer holds the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in the study of the Canadian North and is a professor in the School of the Study of Canada at Trent University in Canada. He's also the network lead of the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. Professor Lackenbauer, over to you.
Well, thanks, Duncan. Thanks to Loughborough University and the Institute for Advanced Studies for organizing this event. I really am honored to be here. I've got a lot of content here, and I think that a lot of the connections to the wonderful questions that were posed to us as panelists beforehand, I really want to engage and synthesize in the question and answer. So my apologies if I whip through this fairly quickly. I want to begin, first of all, just with a reference that appears in Canada's defense policy. I think it's a tidy organization of what some of the key geopolitical drivers are within the Arctic space. This idea of the region, vaguely defined always, which we'll come back, as an important international crossroads. You've got climate change, very well covered in the previous series of speakers, previous panel on the Arctic in the Anthropocene a couple of months ago, issues of international trade, global security coming together, converging. And ironically, in the Canadian defense policy, perhaps a lot of focus then also on cooperative dynamics within the region and some vested interests in the different Arctic states collaborating. But then some pressures, and what I want to emphasize here is a lot of the pressures being identified are really non-kinetic, non-military type of dynamics. And this returns to the core to all critical geopolitical thinking and geopolitics more broadly, the importance of narratives. Think of Sanjay Chaturvedi's definition of Arctic geopolitics as historically contingent but ongoing political project of scripting, staging, and projection of the North Polar region. And I love this graphic matrix provided by the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group of the Arctic Council now more than a decade ago, getting us to think about different potential futures using the axes of governance and resources and trade, which in and of themselves are telling about what we're prioritizing within anticipating these narratives. Even 12 years, 13 years after that matrix has come out, despite a lot of drivers, I think, pointing towards, or a lot of dynamics pointing towards more of a polar saga, a lot of stability in the region, we still are dominated by elite political narratives and news media narratives, and still all too many, in my normative opinion, academic narratives, framing the region as one on the precipice of conflict. And I'm going to suggest here that the straw man of Arctic cooperation or conflict, this simple binary that's been established, is long dead. We should now be expecting and embracing in 2021 that there is cooperation and competition in the Arctic within a world of similar dynamics. And this should come as no surprise. And I'm not the first to say this. Amongst the participants in this conversation are Klaus Dodds and Ingrid Medby, and we've had conversations and arrived at similar insights together. But I want to frame my quick discussion here through a series of myths that I think really do have a lot of gravitas in how we understand Arctic geopolitics or our assumptions around them. The first one is that a primary framework is this idea that Arctic state sovereignty is on thinning ice, that as the physical environment of the region changes, this poses a threat to stability in the region and respect for sovereignty and sovereign rights. The other way I think connected, or a corollary to this, is that the Arctic is an ungoverned, lawless frontier. And I don't know how many academics have spilled ink or digital type in the last decade trying to counter these kind of arguments. And what's interesting is I think in most academic circles, these, at least people who've been studying the Arctic for a long time, these narratives have slipped more to the background and have been supplanted by narratives that talk about the thick layers of governance within the Arctic at different scales, at different levels of analysis that we can probe. And also the myth that a lot of conflict is driven by resource disputes. This myth of the race for resources in the region as if it's this frontier where might makes right. And also a lot of dominant narratives about geopolitics manifest in boundaries and borders and disputes over status of waters, as if this is driving a lot of the tensions in the region. The defining the outer limits of the continental shelf beyond 200-mile exclusive economic zones of the Arctic coastal states is a case in point. Even some of the narratives around Russia submitting a revised extended continental shelf claim earlier this year were telling, in that some commentators were jumping in and saying Russia is showing its aggression, it's expanding its territory. This is not about territory. It's about a limited band of rights, sovereign rights to the seabed and sub-seabed resources. And what's interesting is that often overlooked was that Russia was actually playing exactly by the international rules. And I think this connects back to the comments that we just heard about as dependence on a region grows, the desirability of conflict actually decreases. And I think that's something that we'll come back to in just a second. The second myth is that climate change and access to Arctic resources and uncertainty over boundaries are driving the hard security agenda, that these are driving geopolitical competition in the region. I'd say certainly not particularly from a North American vantage point. I think a lot of the shift towards great power competition is telling, because we've actually shifted from a focus on potential competition, and competition exists, but sort of conflict over resources, and instead focusing on spillover effects. And to me, this forces to the front the importance of distinguishing between threats that pass through or over the Arctic, particularly air and aerospace and space, as Giselle just outlined for us, and distinguishing those from threats to or in the Arctic that are born of Arctic regional dynamics. And we have to think about which region we're talking about as well. So when I'm talking through threats, I'm thinking of strategic delivery systems that may pass over the region to destroy targets outside of the region. What's often opaque is what are the actual threats that we're talking about to the region? And how do we think about the nature of those threats? How do we think of global climate change, for example, as a threat to the Arctic? And then how do we think about environmental change as threats within the Arctic and the nature of threats? And depending on how we approach this question, which mixes in levels of analysis and other things, I think it influences the nature of how we characterize this space. Also tied to that as the third myth is this amorphous concept of the Arctic as an undifferentiated geopolitical or geostrategic space. I'd suggest it's much more helpful to adopt a much more refined lens that asks the question, which Arctic are we talking about? And then proceeding from there to thinking about what that means. So for example, when we look at NATO in the Arctic and a lens, it's very telling that when Canada framed up our justification for changing our stance and opening the window a crack to suggest that we might be interested in having NATO speak about Arctic issues, it's not because of NATO needing to particularly focus on the Arctic itself, but because the Arctic is a means of accessing the sea lines of communication and maritime approaches to allied territory in the North Atlantic. So it's the interconnectedness between, say, Northern Fleet bases on the Kola Peninsula to North Atlantic that pass through Arctic waters, not the Arctic waters themselves that are our fixation. And when we talk generally about the Arctic, we sometimes get confused in being specific about what Arctic dynamics we're describing through a geostrategic lens. The next myth is that Russia believes that it stands to gain from Arctic military conflict and conquest, as if this is Russia's intent to be a revisionist actor in the Arctic space, which goes against the logic that Russia does depend disproportionately to at least the other Arctic states for Arctic resources, both mineral and oil and gas, for its GDP, for its to keep its fragile, precarious economy moving forward. We see lots of maps talking about Russia's Arctic buildup. There's a lot less sophistication in thinking about which of these capabilities are being primarily designed and dedicated for defensive uses, which is within the prerogative of any sovereign state to have to defend its territory and jurisdiction. What are dual use? What are potentially offensive? And with these offensive capabilities, which ones are supporting strategic deterrence or grand strategic intimidation versus targeting other Arctic spaces themselves? And just in the interest of narratives, to remember that within Russia, there's also a spectrum of geopolitical and geostrategic opinion, a range of narratives spanning from liberal internationalists to hawks and Russia first advocates. This is playing out in the information domain, which I think is one of the most interesting spaces of geopolitical competition, ironically, in the Arctic. And then broader questions flowing from this about whether different Arctic lenses set us on a path where we are inherently going to be adversarial with Russia from a Western standpoint, or whether we can be frenemies, as our colleague Elena Wason-Rowe has talked about. Fifth myth I want to present to you is that the Arctic is a leading strategic priority for China. Tons of interest, of course, poured into China as the most revisionist of the non-Arctic states, now casting a lens at the region. I'd suggest if we look soberly at the Arctic and China's actual investment of resources and energies into that particular space, never has a country so quickly elevated to the forefront of geopolitical discussions in a region with which it doesn't have a very strong foothold, as China has done in the Arctic, with such minimal investment of resources. But the questions remain. How do we analyze China's Arctic gambit? Is this a long con, a long-term confidence racket in which China is making sort of lost leader investments in the short term to gain a strategic foothold that it can use to expand outward? How is it using the Zhuilong, its scientific icebreaker, to normalize its presence in the region? Do we look at Chinese foreign investment as key, as a catalyst to encourage resource development projects that otherwise aren't very attractive to Western private sector actors because the returns on investment are too long-term? Is this beneficial in terms of generating economic activity and bringing prosperity to Northern residents? Is this essentially a space of strategic distraction? Is this where China may go and gesture towards the Arctic to encourage the Arctic states to overinvest and overcommit resources to its maneuver elsewhere in the world in more strategically significant spaces from a Chinese standpoint? Or do we see the Arctic as a site of exemplary behavior, where China will behave according to the rules impeccably in hopes that this will allow it to downplay its bad behavior and making a normative judgment there elsewhere in the world? And the big question, can Arctic state sovereignty, sovereign rights, and national interests be balanced with China's global and national interests in the region? The sixth myth that I want to put before you is this notion of Arctic exceptionalism. And I've written a piece with a colleague recently talking about Arctic exceptionalisms. But in essence, this notion that the Arctic is somehow apart from, or should be apart from, global dynamics rather than a part of international systems. I'd suggest that what's more in danger is this overly optimistic 1990s notion that this is what the Arctic is or what the Arctic should be, than Arctic stability itself. And that before we jump ahead and frame things as Arctic threats, particularly through a geopolitical lens, my question is, first we should start and ask, are these threats best analyzed through an Arctic lens, or are we missing our levels of analysis? Or do these challenges require extraordinary Arctic action? And what is it exactly that is extraordinary about this Arctic space compared to the rest of the world? Because I think that a lot of our narratives are actually twisted up because we're expecting the Arctic dynamics to unfold differently than in the rest of the world. And instead we find ourselves in the 2020s disappointed that all of those overly optimistic narratives created in the 1990s have actually not come to pass. How does this then interplay with deterrence and persistent questions of nuclear stability, new questions about the ability to deliver conventional ordnance on remote targets, not in the Arctic, but passing through the Arctic? And then also questions about hybrid warfare and below the threshold activities. And the questions again become, what are specific Arctic vulnerabilities? What is specifically vulnerable about remote locations versus the tools and systems that we've set up more broadly to deal with these challenges? And then are military responses the best way to dissuade or deter these kinds of activities? The last myth is one that I'm going to save for questions, but it's the questions around extreme to whom, accessible to whom under what conditions, and remote from what sense of proportion or positionality, pardon me. And I think that from this standpoint, our whole nature of remoteness when we talk about the Arctic, on the one hand, sometimes betrays our very southern, very metropole lens that we're applying to the region, and at the same time prioritizes or privileges certain imagined or desired narratives about a region becoming more accessible than it actually is, and that accessibility being limited to certain domains under certain conditions. But we can certainly come back to that as well. So final wrap-up takeaway point, calling for a more refined spatial or analysis of our spatial logics around the Arctic, thinking particularly through levels of analysis, asking whether we're getting Arctic security right when we're talking about specific aspects of it and where we're positioning it, and then talking about great power competition. Yes, having spillover effects potentially on the Arctic, we should expect that, but that the narrative has moved away from this primarily being driven by Arctic climate or environmental change, resource boundary disputes, or Arctic governance issues. So calling for more refined lenses to go and distinguish between global, continental, or sub-regional Arctic, and then circumpolar Arctic level threats. Look forward to the questions and answers. Thanks, Duncan.